In this lesson, we'll learn about the importance of seeing scale and light fall off when it comes to rendering inside of Mental Ray. Okay, so I've got this Lesson 4 Begin file open. You can follow along with this from your project files if you'd like. So in the last couple of lessons, we've learned about Mental Ray and specifically the MIA Material X material and how they can work together to produce some really highly realistic renders. Now, the reason being is because the Mental Ray materials are coded in such a way that they are based on the way things work in the real world. So one habit that you can get into that will help you to obtain these type of highly realistic renders is if you begin to model your assets inside of Maya to scale. Now, just looking at this scene right here, it's really kind of hard to gauge the scale of this robot. Or is it? Well, let's look down here between his feet because you can see here between his feet exists the default Maya grid. Well, the default Maya grid, if we were to say just create a simple polygon cube here, you can see it comes in rather small right there in the center of the grid. If I jump to a wireframe view by hitting 4, you can see here that the grid is composed of these grid units. Now, by default, each one of these grid units is 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So that gives you a little bit of scale to think about when you're looking at this simple polygon cube that I've created. It's actually very, very small. And because of this, a lot of the assets that you might initially create here inside of Maya may be much smaller than they would actually be in the real world. Now, that's why it's important to begin to scale these objects up to real-world proportions. So if I come in here and just fit the robot back into my viewport, you can see here our robot in comparison is gigantic. He's big enough to stomp through a city, stepping on buildings and eating cars, and no, he's really not quite that big. This robot is really only about 6 feet tall, maybe a little bit larger. How do I know this? Well, I used a tool when I was scaling him up to really control the scale of him so that he fits with about the scale of an average to a tall male human. Now, if I jump over to my 4-panel view and maybe maximize the front view here, let me show you the tool that I used. So if we come up to the Create menu and under Measure Tools, we were to drop in, say, this Distance tool. What this tool will allow me to do is click 2 points in space here, and it will measure the distance between them. So if I were to click down here, maybe near his feet, and then click up here right at the tallest point of his head, you can see that our robot is about 194 centimeters tall, which, if you convert that over, is roughly 6 feet, a little bit larger in height. So our robot has been modeled to scale. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because when we begin to light this robot, if we want the lighting to behave as it would inside the real world, then it needs to illuminate objects that are scaled to the size they would be in the real world. Let's go ahead and create a light here. We'll just create an area light, just like so. Now that's going to drop it right down here in the center of my grid, so let me just scale that up a bit. And let's go ahead and hit the 7 key on our keyboard, which is going to turn on our lighting preview. Now he's got some nice bright lighting around his ankles, so we need to point this and position it. So if we come over to our 4-panel view, one trick that I like to use is to just come to one of the panel menus here, and we'll come over and look through Selected. What that lets me do is come in here and begin to reposition this light as if it were a camera that I'm looking through. So if we wanted this to illuminate maybe his right side, our screen left side, sort of like so. Kind of position this right about there. I'm kind of gauging this based on the perspective view over here. So you can see that we have a moderate amount of illumination hitting our robot. Let's go ahead and render this out and see what it looks like. I'll just come up here and render the current frame, just like so. And you can see once this renders out that we have a significant amount of light being cast into this scene. Now, why is this? This is actually not the way that light behaves in the real world. You can see here that light inside this scene is basically going on infinitely. It easily reaches the edge of this plane, casting a very large shadow here. And you should understand that this is not the way that light behaves in the real world. So right now, as it sits right now, this light and its intensity is gauged completely based on this intensity attribute right here. Now in the real world, light energy, as soon as it leaves a light source, immediately begins to degrade as it travels through space. This is called light decay, and we can actually add this to this Maya light right over here. You can see there's a decay rate. Currently it's no decay, but if we set this to something like quadratic, which by the way will give us really the most realistic light decay according to the way light behaves in the real world. If we add that to our scene, and you can see here what the effect is, and then we were to come up here and render this out, you're immediately going to notice a pretty significant problem. It looks like nothing at all rendered out. Well, the first thing I would do to troubleshoot this is come up and check the alpha and make sure that yes, our object is indeed there. But this tells me over in the RGB view now that we have a lighting issue here. So what's happening is the light rays that are emitted from this light don't have sufficient energy to reach the surface that is a very short distance away from them. As a matter of fact, if we came over to our 4-panel view and looked, we can use our distance tool and kind of click in here and click over here and see that light's really not that far away from the robot. So what can we do to fix this? Well, whenever you are beginning to introduce light decay into your Maya lights, you're naturally going to need to increase the intensity of the light. So let's bump this up. Let's increase that to something like 1000. You can see there's really no change here. How about we double that? Let's go up to 2000. Now we can start to see a little bit of illumination happening here. So let's double it again. We'll go up to 4000. A little bit more illumination. So you can see kind of this process of just doubling my value until we get to a value that we're happy with. So right now I'm at about 16,000 intensity, again using that quadratic decay rate. So let's see what this looks like. We'll go ahead and render this frame out. And let Maya do some work for us. And you can see here, now we're starting to get a much better illumination result. Now, the distance of this light does play a role in the way that we see this illumination on these surfaces. You'll notice that because it's fairly close, not very far from our source or illumination object at all, we're starting to get some of these areas where the intensity of the light is vastly different than others. So this amount of contrast is purely a result of the increased light energy when the light rays are striking this source here, as opposed to this surface over here. Now we can start to sort of mitigate this type of thing by increasing the amount of distance between our illumination subject and the light source. So if we were to save this for comparison, let's just jump over here, and in our 4-panel view, we'll just again look through our selected here, and I'm going to back the light up a little bit. We'll back it up to about right there. We'll come back to our render view, and let's render this out again and see what the result is. All right, fantastic. Now, the illumination has changed drastically here. So this was before I moved the light, and this is after. Notice the result of increasing that distance between the light and the illumination object results in what seems to be flatter illumination, less contrast in the illuminated areas. So it's also more evenly distributed around the surfaces that are aligned to where they're receiving this light. So this is typically a good thing. Now, we actually, if this is going to be our key light, we may actually want this to be a little bit brighter so we get a little bit more contrast. So let's go ahead and raise this intensity to maybe something like 20. Let's just increase it by 8 here. Let's go ahead and go up to maybe 24,000. And we'll just render that out again. Okay, so now we're getting some good illumination here. Now, where this can be useful is when we're trying to create kind of a secondary light. So if we wanted to come back over here to our perspective view and drop in maybe a fill light, let's just use another area light here. And I'll go ahead and scale this up. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that scaling a light source, as you can see here as I scale this, is changing its intensity. And the area light is one of the only lights that this actually is, it is the only light that this actually is apparent on, this intensity change. So let me just go ahead and get this light aligned where I want it to be here. We'll just come over and look through selected again. Come over here and kind of fit this over on the other side of our robot. Maybe right about there. And I'm going to go ahead and set the color of this light to kind of this blue color, maybe right about here. And we'll go ahead and again use our quadratic decay. And let's set this first to, we'll just start at around 8,000. We'll jump in here and render this out and see what it looks like. And you can see we're starting to get a result of this blue light. Now what happens if I really ramp that intensity up? Let's bump it up to, say, 24,000. We'll double it twice. Actually, yeah, 24,000 should work. You can see a good amount of illumination there. So now, in doing so, keep in mind what's happening here. These light rays and the energy is having less of an opportunity to decay. So you can see we're getting more of that very saturated blue illumination on some of these surfaces here. Now, if that's what you're looking for, then that could be a good thing. But in this case, that's really starting to command a little bit more attention than I would like. So what we can do to sort of offset this is to either back this light up or drop the intensity down. So I'm going to back this light up so I can try and flatten that light out, that lighting result out a bit. We'll go ahead and save that for comparison. And when our render comes back, we can scrub back and forth, and you can start to see how that light isn't quite as intense, but it's really starting to flatten out a little bit more. Now, ultimately, I probably want to play a little bit more with the position of this light, maybe bring it around a little bit so it hits a little bit more of those surfaces on his chest. We could even come in here and begin to scale this light up. But again, keep in mind that scaling up an area light changes its intensity. So I scaled it up a very small amount and moved it around to the front just a little bit. So scaling it up has this kind of an effect on the light intensity. You can see a very small amount, being that I didn't scale it an incredible amount here. So hopefully you can start to see the relationship here between the scale of our object as opposed to the distance a light needs to be to properly illuminate that object. Again, getting in the habit of modeling your assets to real-world scale here inside of Maya will do wonders for the renders that you create and the light setups that you create here inside of Maya. Now, inside that rendered result, what we're looking at here is basically direct illumination. It's the lights that are striking these surfaces are directly coming from these two lights that we've created. Now, this, again, isn't really the way that this happens in the real world, because light doesn't just strike a surface and stop. Light bounces, and this creates what we call indirect lighting or even ambient lighting. So you can see there's some surfaces here on the model that really aren't illuminated at all. You can see kind of down around this leg right here and kind of on his shin right here. Really no illumination in those areas. Now, if we were to come in here and maybe go into the render settings, we can come over here under indirect lighting and utilize either global illumination or final gather. Let's go ahead and use final gather. Now, I'm not going to get much into final gather, but we'll actually do a lesson on that later in this course. But just know that that's going to allow more of this light to start bouncing in the scene, creating some of that indirect illumination that we're after here. So if I go ahead and render that out, and we'll just wait for that to complete, and then we can compare these two renders. You can see there's after the indirect illumination has been added, and then there's before. So you can see that some of these areas that were really receiving no illumination at all prior, now we're starting to get some of that nice indirect illumination, and you can see the effect that has. So with that said, now looking here at this, if we were to zoom in on this, you might start to notice some areas where we've got some noise, and that's where the shadows tend to be a little bit softer. And you can especially see that over here if we start to look at this shadow that's being cast on the ground plane. So what I'd like to move on to in the next lesson is I'd like to show you how we can begin to sort of soften out and improve the renders where we might see some noticeable artifacts or noise.